Excerpts from Signatures in Stone, written by Linda Lappin, narrated by Edward E. French. We are constantly immersed in a network of signs and symbols whose meaning eludes us, but which, if only we could read them, would reveal every detail of our past and even predict our future. Like anticipatory echoes, they tingle in our consciousness, building in crescendo until the event they herald becomes fully manifest. Afterward, they linger for a time before being drowned out by a new tide of signs rushing in upon us. Such signatures are everywhere. A glove dropped in the street, an unusual design of seaweed washed up on the beach, a picture postcard addressed to a stranger and slipped in between the pages of a borrowed book. In this chapter, Sleuth Daphne visits the sacred wood of Bomarzo in the company of the art historian Professor Finestone. Together, they puzzle over the real meaning of the monstrous sculptures in the garden and the identity of the artist who created them. For Finestone, they are fragments of the artist's consciousness, the residue of his violent emotions transmitted through time. For Daphne, they are hallucinatory signatures, omens of future events in which we may all find our destiny inscribed. Outside the gates of the sacred wood, the surrounding hillsides were ablaze with yellow broom and luxuriant lilacs of lavender and white. But inside there was no spring. An indefinite season reigned of monotonous evergreens and weeds which never bloom. Still, with the milder weather, it was pleasant to be outdoors, and after breakfast I often accompanied Finestone through the wood, where he inspected the previous day's labors and gave instructions to the men. Each day a new colossus or group of statues emerged from the tangled vegetation in the sacred wood, as 100 years or more of vines gone wild and rotting tree stumps were ripped out of the ground and burned away. The gardeners were not working systematically by clearing off an area completely before continuing on to the next one. They shifted from one spot to another, creating bald patches in the greenery from which the statues emerged, still covered in dirt and lichen, which then had to be carefully brushed away. Finestone claimed he had discovered only about a third of the statues which he believed the sacred wood contained. Many of the major figures, descriptions of which he had found in letters written by Orsini to his friends, were still to be located. I soon noted, however, that when giving orders to the men, the professor unfailingly seemed to know which lump of ivy and briars hid a statue and which concealed merely a mass of unshaped stone. I began to wonder if he was in possession of his own map, with precise indications as to where the sculptures were situated. "Over there we will find a life-size elephant," he'd predict at breakfast. Or, "That will be the Fountain of Three Graces." And inevitably, by the end of the day, when the workmen had thrown down their scythes and axes and gone to rinse off their grime and sweat in the stream, those very figures had been identified. Once I asked him how he knew where to look, and he replied, "My nose." As we roamed about the wood together, Finestone gradually took me more into his confidence, allowing me to glimpse a bit of what his research consisted in, and even engaging my assistance. One important task I helped him with was cleaning the inscriptions. For near every statue an inscription was usually found, sometimes chiseled on a crumbling patch of wall, sometimes etched on a nearby boulder. These had been placed here supposedly to guide the visitor in interpreting the gaping gorgons and winged monstrosities peopling the sacred wood. My task was to clean the earth and lichen away from the inscriptions with a wire brush, stain the carved letters with crushed beet juice so that they would stand out more clearly, then copy them down in a notebook. Like the statues themselves, the inscriptions teased my mind and often bore the unmistakable resonance of a signature attuned to my current situation. "Animos fit quiescendo prudentior ergo," said one. "But what does it mean?" I asked, for I had forgotten much of the little Latin I once knew. "Contemplative life tames the soul," Finestone explained with a sigh. And I suppose it was good advice for us both after the defections of Clive and Amelia, each of whom, however, at least during the daytime, had become unusually discreet about their liaison. I rarely saw them exchange a single word now, though whenever she was near, Clive watched her with a bedazzled, hangdog expression. Sometimes, while I was working with Finestone, I would see them in the sacred wood, but never together. Amelia might be treading through the long grass with a basket on her way to gather wild asparagus or chicory which grew along the stream. Clive, after 10 o'clock in the morning, might be setting up his easel near a statue. I thought it very likely that they might have a clandestine meeting place somewhere in the park, beyond where the men were working. Our other companions, Nigel and Danilo, never visited the sacred wood at all, at least as far as I could see. They preferred jaunts through the countryside in Nigel's Packard, which Danilo had learned to drive. Another task I helped Finestone with was measuring the statues, not only their height and their maximum and minimum diameter, but also the distance from nose to mouth, or elbow to fingertip. These measurements were carefully noted down, and from them Finestone made abstruse calculations which I did not understand at first. He explained that the proportions of the figures might be one of the keys to the identity of the artist who designed them. I realized that if I could learn more about Finestone's research, this would help further my own inquiry into the meaning of the drawing. But he was careful never to give away the name of the artist he believed had conceived the sculptures and their overall setting within the sacred wood. Sometimes I felt he intentionally led me astray, suggesting now one, now another school or artist, Vignola, Leone, Salvati, who might have been responsible for the original design of the park. For each name Finestone supplied an argument in their favor, only to rebut it completely. "In any case," he went on, "not all these statues were made by the hand of a master carver or his pupils." He pointed out a nearby group of the Three Graces which had recently come to light. At first glance, with their hefty behinds and crude facial features, they certainly belied their name. Those figures, for example, are obviously the work of unskilled beginners, perhaps even of slaves. Perhaps, I mused, but there may be another interpretation, too. Those ladies may be a protest against the canon of physical beauty of his era, with which he did not agree. Or it might be a warning. Don't be fooled by a pretty body and face. True grace may not always lie in a harmonious body and an attractive face. Or maybe he didn't like women's bodies. An interesting thought, he conceded. We walked in silence for a few moments. "I believe," he said, "this wood was an esoteric school for sculptors in which local students of diverse talents learned to carve with differing degrees of success. The school was probably presided over by a great genius of the period, who surely designed, if not sculpted with his own hand, at least 3 or 4 of the statues here, and breathed his own life and spirit into them to make them immortal. Or at least left instructions on how that could be done. This accounts for the enormous psychic energy the sacred wood and its figures exude." I supposed he was referring once again to the ancient Egyptian art of animating statues. It was a thrilling idea that such knowledge might have been passed down through the Renaissance and Baroque eras to us today. He had never spoken before of his theories in such detail, and I was fascinated. "Will you share with me the secret of his name?" He smiled. "I assure you it is an illustrious name and a momentous discovery. After I publish my findings, backed up by irrefutable evidence, the whole history of Renaissance art will have to be rewritten. The sacred wood is his most complex work, his spiritual testimony, his manifesto created near the end of his life. The statues you see here were the custodians of his most intimate thoughts, dreams, and emotions. And, of course, his demons." We had discussed this previously, and I had not then received a satisfactory answer to my question either. "And not those of his patron, Vicino Orsini? Didn't you say before that the statues might illustrate and commemorate events in Orsini's life?" "That merely formed the pretext. The artist who sculpted these forms surely drew them from the depths of his own soul. It was, I'd say, a tormented one." I was thinking of the wrestling giants, trying to relate them to what I knew about the lives of the great artists of the Renaissance. Reflecting on Finestone's studies of proportion, I considered the possibility that Leonardo might be the artist he had in mind, but Leonardo had produced no sculptures that I had ever heard of, and probably was long dead before the first stones were carved in Bomarzo. From what I remembered of art history, the dates did not coincide. Moreover, the place was much too dark and perverse for the likes of Leonardo. I wondered what bearing the parchment I had found might have on Finestone's research. During his long stay at the villa before we had arrived, he had had time to inspect every drawer and cupboard, to study letters and other documents in the archives, analyze the sculpture's stylistic features and proportions, and match all this with the chronologies of the artists' lives. Had he really found all the evidence he required? The drawing now in my possession might contain a clue to corroborate or refute his theories. Was I ungenerous in not wanting to share it with him? If indeed Finestone's discoveries were as momentous as he claimed, and if that drawing should offer significant proof of those claims, then it could be of great value, at least to him. Just how much might it be worth? While my mind was fiddling with these calculations, a sudden cry filled the mild spring air, and a workman came running toward us through the tall grass, waving his cap and shouting, "Professore, professore, la bocca dell'inferno!" "The hellmouth?" I asked, recalling the figure on the drawing. Eyes ablaze, Finestone grabbed my arm and hastened after the workman, his cane thumping along the ground. Before us rose a steep flight of eroding steps carved from a single mass of rock, thickly carpeted with moss, leading straight into the flank of the hillside. Midway up we could make out an opening, like the mouth of a cave, still partly curtained by tendrils of ivy and honeysuckle. 3 men on ladders were at work chopping at the vegetation with hatchets and ripping off vines, slowly revealing a grotesque, ivy-bearded mask, carved in the rock face, splotched with large patches of moss. From inside came the echoing voices as other workmen hacked away at the briars choking the entrance and filling the interior of the cavern. "Attenti, una vipera, ammazzatela, watch out, a viper, kill it!" cried Manu's voice from inside, and his shout of alarm was followed by a smash of stone against the ground. A hand reached through the ivy and tossed the snake out through the entrance and down the stairs, where it landed precisely at our feet. I screamed. "That's a viper, all right," said Finestone, bending down to inspect it through his bifocals. "A big one, too. A bite would kill you in minutes." I stared, mesmerized at the reptile. Its short, thick, ugly body, with jagged brown markings, and its triangular head certainly resembled the specimen preserved in a jar in the library. Then, to my horror, I saw it writhe and attempt to rear its damaged head. "Heavens, it's still alive!" I shrieked and stumbled back, nearly slipping on the mossy trail. "Attenti, attenti, non vi movete! Colperà! Watch out, don't move! It's about to strike!" warned one of the men on the ladders. But before he could scramble down to our rescue, Finestone, with unexpected promptness, impaled the reptile with his cane. The snake writhed once more, and then was still. "Bel colpo, professor," cheered the men. And it had been a good shot indeed. The snake was most decidedly dead. I gave a sigh of relief. Finestone withdrew his cane from the viper's body, kicked it aside, and showed me the tip of his improvised weapon, where a bright steel blade flashed, sharp as a razor. He squeezed the silver handle of his cane forcibly, and the blade retracted with a snap. "I told you this was good for discouraging snakes. I never go anywhere without it." I must say I was surprised. I would not have thought him the type of man to carry a weapon far more deadly than any viper. Enough ivy had now been cleared away from the facade of the cave so that the mask beneath was visible in its entirety. A hideous, giant brown face with arching brows and eyes agoggle observed us, more in astonishment than in wrath or horror to have been awakened from his vegetative sleep. I was awed by the sight, of course, but I was even more amazed by the fact that I had already seen such a face before. In Paris. There is an artist's cabaret in Boulevard Clichy called La Fère, where the facade of the building is shaped like a giant's mask similar to this one. To enter those smoky premises, where all pleasures and transgressions may be sampled for a fee, you pass through a laughing mouth beneath the bared teeth and gloating eyes. The artist who designed that facade could not have seen this hell-mouth in Bomarzo, but might have seen sketches inspired by it, or even dreamed it. With one subtle difference. This mouth was open not in laughter, promising pleasure of the flesh. Like a vortex, the perfect O of its lips was designed to suck you in and keep you there. A head poked out through the entrance. It belonged to Manu. "Safe to come in now," he called to Finestone. "We killed the vipers in their nest." Finestone offered me his arm as we climbed the slick stairs and stepped over the threshold into a narrow chamber illuminated by a torch fastened to the wall. The men crowded to one side so that we might view the chamber unencumbered. I shuddered at the sight of a small heap of dead vipers among the uprooted weeds and brambles near the entrance. The first time I had entered the sacred wood with Finestone, I had felt a sharp drop in temperature, as though the sun had momentarily withdrawn its warmth and had cast me shivering in the shadows. This time, standing in that dank chamber, I felt a similar chilling sensation, though an octave more intense, a sinking, cold, unredeemed feeling, an oppression accumulating in my breast. I felt I had been turned into a lifeless piece of clay. My expression must have betrayed my extreme unease, for Manu asked if I were all right, or if I wanted him to fetch a chair for me, which I declined. This was most certainly not the first time I had visited a tomb or a crypt. I had been in Egyptian and Greek tombs before, which were darker, more claustrophobic, and far more suffocating than this. But they had not disturbed me in such a way. Nor was this dismal mental and physical sensation produced by anything one could see in the tomb, like mouldering piles of bones or skulls one often finds in crypts, which are certainly not cheery to contemplate. The hellmouth was empty except for a stone table, or perhaps it was an altar, this too covered in moss. There was no other decoration, furnishing, or inscription. The chamber had been hollowed out of a huge rock set in the flank of the hill and formed a perfect, resonating chamber. Finestone hummed a note, and the place vibrated eerily, lifting the hairs on the nape of my neck. He turned to me expectantly, as he did whenever he wished to sound out my reactions, but all I wanted was to leave that place immediately and return to the light of day. I turned back to the entrance, telling the professor I needed a bit of fresh air, and after a moment he followed me out again. Outside, the men had succeeded in clearing away the remaining vines from the facade, where above the mouth an inscription was exposed. Ogni pensiero vola, meaning, every thought flies. I pondered this. Thoughts fly in time and space. Was this a confirmation of telepathy, that thoughts live outside the body and may be communicated across time? I had no ready solution. I imagined that the hellmouth must represent something special to Finestone, perhaps the proof he sought. Gravely he surveyed the face and scribbled a bit in the notebook he always carried with him. I guessed he was studying the proportions of the features. I was sure of one thing as we made our way down the stairs and back out of the sacred wood. The giants had promised us that our perspective would be turned upside down and that we would become impure. The turtle told us not to force or race, but to plod our way with our angelic burden. The ugly graces told us not to be dazzled or fooled by appearances. And now the hellmouth promised a deep plunge into the depths of our own ambiguity. An excerpt from Signatures in Stone, a Bomarzo mystery, presented here by permission of the author, Linda Lappin. Narrated by Edward E. French. Copyright 2013, Linda Lappin. All rights reserved. Signatures in Stone is available in paperback and ebook formats from www.amazon.com and from the publisher, www.pleasureboatstudio.com.